Hello all, I'm Alice O'Neill and I'm one of the founders of United Culture. A very warm welcome to you all today to the first of several conversations that we'll be having over the coming months about the future of work. We'll be talking about the highs and the lows and the opportunities and the challenges that we're all being faced with on a daily basis. Today, I have the great pleasure of chairing our first panel with a brilliant group of communication leaders who'll be discussing how we need to engage people differently in light of the experience that we've just lived through. I will let them introduce themselves, but joining me is Paul Downey, Head of Employee Communications at Microsoft, Jennifer Thomas, who most recently was the Head of Communications at Direct Line Group, and Victoria Lewis-Stevens, who is Managing Director for United Culture. Jennifer, do you want to kick us off with a quick introduction?
Yes, thank you, and hello everyone. So a bit about me. Spent most of my career on the external side of comms, actually, looking at financial, corporate PR, as well as brand and consumer campaigns and PR there. And then most recently at Direct Line Group, I sort of took over the lead for internal communications and really looking at our employee engagement, but most importantly, how our employees connect with what we're trying to achieve as a business, our purpose and our strategy. So a lot of focus there. And I suppose given we're in current times, actually crisis management was probably my latest feat just before leaving, getting all of our employees working from home, but also really keeping them engaged. So it'd be great to share some of that insight today.
Brilliant, thank you. And Paul, over to you.
Hi, so I've got a blended career of internal and external communications. I actually started my career in external communications, working for various PR agencies, managing consumer brands such as Disney, BT, Sony. Then I went to press office at Hachette for Apache, managing all the media and brand for the magazine publishing arm. Skipped into government for just about 6 years, so heading up internal communications teams for departments like international trade, Home Office, number 10 in Cabinet Office, HMRC, before I went on to Money Supermarket Group, where I was responsible for their internal communications and cultural transformation. I'm now head of employee communications at Microsoft UK. I joined there at the end of April, so just at the beginning of lockdown. So it's been a bit of a baptism of fire as a newbie to the organization, but also working in the team responsible for communicating the company's response to the pandemic. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm really thrilled that it's the first that I'm part of, and hopefully can impart some top tips.
Great, thanks, Paul. And V, over to you.
So I'm Victoria, founder and managing director at United Culture. Like Paul, I've got a blend of in-house and agency experience across multiple disciplines, so government relations, PR, engagement, employee comms. In-house, I work for brands like British Gas, HSBC, State Street, and throughout my agency life, I've worked for numerous brands from Marriott International, Hilton, JP Morgan, AXA, right through to companies like Bacardi Limited. So quite broad sector experience. Latterly, my focus has been on engagement and building performance-driven businesses through unlocking and engaging talent within a company.
Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks all. Let's get stuck into talking about bouncing back post-COVID. The pace that businesses have had to adapt over the past few months has been pretty staggering. And I think one of the things that we were struck by was that even the most cumbersome and bureaucratic of organisations have managed to adapt quickly and innovate when under pressure. What we're most interested in today is really talking about what companies can learn from their response to COVID, and also diving into how they can use those learnings to really spark growth within their business and expedite the recovery. Jennifer, I think we've seen some absolutely amazing examples of organisations responding to COVID in a variety of different ways. How do you think that those responses will impact a brand's reputation moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, every organisation and business would have had their own culture, the way that they operate and communicate, pre-COVID. And then we suddenly find ourselves in this extraordinary situation where you've really lost that face-to-face interaction, and something that we rely heavily on still today, even with all the technology. So I think that there were sort of two major issues with kind of going into lockdown. One was, how do you just keep your business and your people updated on what's going on? So, we had different things happening at different times. Understandably, employees would be concerned, worried, not sure, do I go into the office? Do I not? What do I do? So for me, it was about actually, how do you just get the information across? And actually, how do you make sure your employees know where to find that information? When does that information become available? So there becomes a bit of a routine, and we haven't got all of this ad hoc, and then people might miss things. So there was something around what's the structure and pace of informational communications, I think, which was really important for the beginning of this crisis. And then I think once you have that established, you then start to move much more into sort of engagement communications. How do you keep that culture and that buzz going when we can't see each other every day? So I think a lot of organizations, it would probably have been a bit of a wake-up call to actually how strong that engagement foundation was to begin with. If you were lucky enough to have real depth and strength, which thankfully we were, then it's about how do you build off that and not lose any momentum. If you're an organization that was maybe just trying to build that at beginning stages, or actually that wasn't quite a strength for you in the beginning, I can imagine it would have been a bit of a panic about actually now how do we bring our people together, irrespective of the size of your business or organization. So I think quite a lot of organizations have had to learn and probably value communications even more. I think it was the hub of everything that every business had to do. It was, it wouldn't matter how big you were, what sector you were, what industry you were in. Suddenly, actually, we were all together in the same situation. So I'm hoping that businesses have learnt actually how important comms can be, but actually through it, thinking about, well, how do we do that? What channels do we use? How are our people responding? So were we checking during that time to see if actually what we were doing was resonating? And how do we take all of that learning, hopefully, forward to the next phase?
It's interesting. You touched a little bit there on how what we're valuing is changing slightly. And I think although this pandemic has been very, very unique for a lot of organizations, one thing that's absolutely become crystal clear is the importance of having incredibly strong crisis communication skills. So, Paul, are there any tips that you can share about how to manage a crisis and still keep employees engaged?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think from a communications perspective, there's the usual operational things that you can roll out, so communicating in a timely, honest, open manner, using senior leaders to dispel the rumor mill. But I think that one of the key things to articulate during a crisis is what you want to keep your employees engaged with. People really need to be engaged with their work, with their teams. And if we think about retention being a byproduct of engagement, with the managers especially. So I think that in terms of top tips, I think it's really important during crisis to keep people engaged with the managers. So, reminding people how important the work of your business is. So what is that purpose that employees believe in and that anchors everyone to work for your company? Similarly, reminding each person that their work and contribution is really important and vital. So, you can still send virtual thank yous and celebrate successes. It is really important to activate your managers to inspire and motivate and connect with teams regularly. I think that's really, really important. And also ensuring that, during the crisis, ensuring that colleagues can still connect with each other. So whether it's virtual coffee breaks or lunch breaks or afternoon drinks, just to bring people together, that, we've lost that water cooler moment in the offices when you go off and grab a coffee and speak to someone. But I think also what's really important during the crisis is to remember that things like this need to be inclusive. So, people should still have the choice of whether they feel comfortable taking part, especially virtually when people are juggling different things. And, it's okay to not take part if you're not comfortable. And I think finally, what's really powerful during a crisis is checking in with people. You're not walking into an office now and saying, hey, how are you? But there's still power in asking someone, over a Teams chat or over a video chat, how was your weekend? We can still do that virtually. So I think there's real power during a crisis of still connecting with people and using the tools that you have to do that.
You both touched on the fact that organisations are obviously a lot more disparate at the moment. How did you adapt to primarily working from home? And do either of you see a complete return to the office spaces in future?
Shall I start on that one? So I think it was a huge adaptation, actually. I love working from home, so I had semi days where I worked from home anyway, so it wasn't completely new to me. But I think going back to communications being sort of the central to all of this change now suddenly going on in the organization, it gave me appreciation for people that don't regularly work from home and suddenly we're at home all the time, all day, having to really face into and lean into all of the other commitments they've got going on in the household, or, you know, a household full of people, and actually how do you manage all of that? So I think when we were thinking through how do you communicate, back to what Paul was saying, actually, how do you engage and connect people, and actually just remember that we're all sort of going through a struggle, and it will be different for everybody. We really wanted to make sure our communications was accessible in different formats, via different methods. You were hearing from a variety of people. So back to everything we've said, you've lost that water cooler moment. You can't just go and have a friendly 2-minute chat around the desk. So for us, it was actually, how do you keep those mini interactions going virtually? And also, how do you encourage leadership? And when I say leadership, I mean in its widest sense, from the very, very top of the organization, but through to everybody who manages people. Actually, what does that relationship look like when you, again, can't physically see each other often? And it's something like, what's that one-on-one interaction? But also, how do you then bring the team in? How do you keep people updated? But probably most importantly, how do you keep people motivated? And again, it's recognizing that we're all individuals in that. So I think there's a greater emphasis to really know the people in your team and understand what their new lives look like. You know, even if you didn't really know what their lives look like before COVID, I think that's become even more important. And will we return? Look, I think it's really hard. I mean, especially, you know, given there's new news coming, you know, back and forth. Are we in lockdown? What version of lockdown are we in? I think it's really difficult. My advice would almost be try not to worry about that too much, about whatever the final outcome is, whenever that happens. I think as communicators, we are very adaptable. And one of the things we've learned is how to just evolve what we're doing based on what's going on outside of our doors. And I think everybody kind of has to have that flexibility. But if you sort of keep to those core principles of bringing people into the fold, connecting with people, updating people, thanking people, celebrating, some really core principles, you can do that whether we're all in the office, all at home, or a mix, which is probably what the reality is going to be.
Absolutely. Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that another communications challenge that we found ourselves with was how to attract and retain employees' attention. You know, when everyone was juggling a lot of multiple things, homeschooling, illnesses, maybe caring for a family member, and also all the mental health issues that, you know, we know are associated with lockdown. So for me, from an employee comms perspective, I was really conscious of the time that people now were spending at screens. That was really on my mind, and something, you know, what Jennifer said about making things accessible and also really making them inclusive for everyone. You know, so I was thinking, for example, if we're having an all company event, what's the maximum time that it should be, you know, in front of a screen? If we're thinking everyone is in front of a screen, we don't have the luxury of people being able to turn up to an atrium, you know, and people like that, you know, and they'll be willing to spend maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours sitting listening to a face-to-face. But, you know, making it as inclusive as possible and also maintaining that engagement was really top of my mind. And also another thing was really providing the option of being able to catch up on demand at a more convenient time, you know, what Jennifer's saying about making things accessible. And similarly for me, there was a lot of content, obviously, that we produced over that period to keep people updated. So I made a really conscious effort to keep it short, snappy, really to the point. So it was really interesting that our output of snackable videos increased hugely. You know, we found from employee comments and watch rates that these formats were really, really popular. And also they were really easy for us to to create, jumping on a Teams video call with someone and recording something and then editing it and getting that out across our channels. So in terms of thinking about returning to offices, I think that there will be some return. I think that people still need that physical connection, with colleagues, with buildings. Even if you think about kind of people's connection to their journey to and from work, I think that's a ritual that people really like and possibly are craving. But I think it should be when people are comfortable to do that. So I think from a business perspective that it's vital that any return to office, their approach is really inclusive. Everyone needs to feel that it's their choice and they decide and make that choice when it's the right time for them. Because, as Jennifer made a really good point, it's made us really see into people's lives, into their homes. We're having calls in people's kitchens and bedrooms and studies or gardens, so everyone has kind of different things that are happening in their lives. I think that's really important. But I think that the pandemic will shift what office life now looks like and what it means. We've seen a more blended approach to office home working, but people are still delivering, and businesses having to transform digitally in such a short space of time now means people are able to be more agile, and businesses are realizing that it should be more about people's outcomes, not just their presenteeism in the office, and it's really interesting. There was a recent trend report from Microsoft UK, and it found that 72% of UK employees and managers reported a desire to continue working at home at least part-time. So I think that's really interesting in terms of the impact. So it's sort of making me think about, well, what's the impact of culture on an organization in the future? And so I'm really keen to explore what that means for culture and communications, and how do we keep employees connected and living and breathing the culture in a new blended modern workplace. I think it's a really interesting time for communications.
Yeah, V, you're probably very well placed to answer this, because I think it's a question that we hear almost on a daily basis. How, if we are moving towards this, blended model that you've both just talked about, how can businesses actually retain their culture?
I think the working world's fundamentally shifted. I can't see us going back to sort of wholesale office-based working. I think this blended approach is here to stay, and certainly for the foreseeable future. If we do end up shifting back, I think for the foreseeable future, it's here to stay. United Culture, we talk about culture as being an outcome. So you don't create a culture, you get a culture as an outcome of a bunch of activities that you do and behaviours that you reinforce within your business. I think in crisis mode, a lot of organisations have adapted working practices and approaches across the employee journey so that they're fit for purpose. They work, and the company can kind of muddle through this crisis moment. I think, honestly, if you want to maintain your culture within your organisation, you've almost got to review and evaluate your employee journey end to end through the lens of you now having a hybrid working experience, and adapt where you need to. It can't just be a case of things you used to do face to face, we'll just pop it online now. You've got to really think through, what does it feel like, and how do you build an experience that will drive that right cultural outcome? So I think it's a big task for organisations, because there are a lot of organisations that struggle with grappling culture anyway. But I think there's a big job to be done to kind of almost re-establish what's the experience you're trying to create, and what's the journey that you need to develop in order to create that experience.
And so one more point just on the culture, which you reminded me of. I think when we go through something like we're continuing to go through, or any crisis actually, culture becomes a moment of truth, right? You've got a real opportunity. So all those values that you've got plastered all over the wall, all those statements that you've got in PowerPoint decks, or that is printed on marketing material for said organization, that's when you have to really live up to all of those words. So how you treat your people, how you treat your customers, clients, stakeholders, all of that's got to live through those behaviors and values that you've said you are, or again, that you've got written somewhere. So in a way, I think something like this provides us with an opportunity actually to have real moments for our culture to come alive.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting, actually. A lot of clients that we're talking to at the moment are also raising concerns about how they shift back to a more normal hybrid model. So a lot of the things that they've done for employees actually aren't sustainable long term. So they're actually really grappling with, how do we keep our culture alive and stay true to what we believe in from a purpose perspective? We are a purpose-led organisation, but how do we dial it back a little bit so that we can actually make what we're doing now sustainable for the longer term? So it's a challenge from a reputational perspective, because I think some of those organisations don't want to kind of make a retrograde step for fear of being criticised, because they're, you haven't lived up to your purpose, or that's sort of slightly at odds with the culture you've now created. So there's some really interesting challenges, I think, for organisations to grapple with.
I think one of those challenges as well is how people can collaborate in the most efficient way as well. So, Paul, how are you seeing people collaborating right now, and how do you think we can keep innovation alive too?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. I think that it's forced people to be a lot more intentional with the digital tools that they have, and actually become a lot more agile with them, so whether it's now creating a new team channel for product chats, or starting a conversation on a specific topic on Yammer, or jumping on a quick video call to sound out an idea, or to have a conversation, rather than kind of the standard, I'll just send someone an email. So actually, in a way, it's quite a contradiction in terms of kind of, even though it's virtual, I think it's made people a lot more social, so they've been a lot more agile with their channels, and also it's forcing us to keep going back to those digital channels to be social and to connect with people. And I think from an innovation point of view, it goes back to focusing on what your purpose is. We talked about purpose earlier, so how you can galvanize that to continue, supporting your customers as a business. So at Microsoft UK, we've seen some brilliant innovation over such a short period of time. If you think about the work that we did with the NHS to implement HoloLens, or the ventilator challenge, and so thinking about kind of really how we're supporting customers through and to accelerate their digital journeys, and from that having all the success and the stories to celebrate internally. And I think it was really, really interesting. So mid-pandemic, Microsoft chief exec Satya Nadella said, he spoke about how the world has gone through 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. I mean, that is really powerful. So I think for a lot of companies, that has been innovation in itself, being able to implement all these new ways of working in such a short period of time. I think that when we think about innovation, we think about huge things, but actually there's really small bits of innovation, and being able to shift your whole ways of working is innovation in itself. And I think from a comms perspective, again, it's about thinking about your employees as your customers. So how can you innovate your channels and content to make it easier for people to consume their media in an engaging and useful way, and also kind of doing something differently to make people sit up and take notice. I think that's really, really important. And I think there's something for me about feedback. Feedback is really, really important. During crisis mode, it's even more important to use that feedback and insight, to continue to develop your content that your people need, because that's how you're going to really get your cut through and, continue to keep making an impact.
Brilliant, thank you. And V, when it comes to innovating, I think one of the hardest things to do during a moment like this is actually motivate people, to want to collaborate really with each other. How do you think organisations can motivate when people are working remotely and during a moment of high disruption?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Jennifer's already talked to this to a degree when she sort of talked about what motivates one person won't necessarily motivate another. There's no one size fits all, and for any team or for any business, I think at the height of the crisis, honestly, good managers were motivating people by reaching out personally, creating opportunity for the teams to still get together. They were all in it together, although everybody's personal experience of, the crisis was different. Actually, we were all facing the same crisis. So there's that sense of camaraderie that you had in organisations and in teams. Longer term, I think we've got to think a little bit differently. I think managers have got to understand what drives their people, They've got to get to know them. They've got to ask them. They've also got to reach out and make them part of the solution. Get them involved in defining any transformation or journey that you need to go on as an organisation, so that you can adapt to the new world in the longer term. I think there's a role. I think you'd struggle to be motivated and contribute to an organisation in a meaningful way if you don't understand the direction of travel. So I think there's also a big role for organisations to remind people what's their purpose, why they're here, why do they exist, and actually what's the strategy that they've developed that ladders up to that enables them to deliver against that. And then how do you connect your individual role to that strategy? So I think, connecting up that story, because it will have changed. Most organisations strategically will alter, even if it's just a small bit, they will alter. But reminding employees of that journey, making the connections and helping them to understand, I think is the first step in then starting to tap into what drives and motivates them. For some people, it's as simple as just giving them recognition for the contribution that they make to that journey, to that story. For other people, it's much more complex. And you've really got to understand people and get under the skin of what makes them tick. But your starting point is making sure they understand where the business is going, the purpose, how it ladders up, what behaviours and what output is required from an individual, empower them to kind of make some moves within that, and then work out really how do you reach out to that person on a personal level.
I think if I could just add something that you touched on at the beginning around camaraderie, and I wonder whether that's kind of, we always talk about kind of authentic leaders and honest leaders, and I wonder whether there was something about that sense of everyone being in it together, and not having, the polished all company events anymore, but actually you're seeing your chief exec or, your CFO at home in, their own living space, talking to an entire company. And also kind of being really honest about the challenges that they're facing as well. I think that it probably has had such a huge impact on how business see leaders and how they've kind of seen them being even more authentic, which kind of cuts through quite a lot of that motivation engagement. So in a way, again, it's a kind of weird kind of contradiction in terms of all the kind of awfulness that's happened around the pandemic. Actually, that's been something that I think has organically happened because people have wanted to connect and engage, and seeing that authenticity and allowing essentially a business or your team into your home is very personal. And it's something that I don't think we could have even thought about or imagined when we were kind of pre kind of pandemic and thinking about planning how our leaders communicate with businesses. So I think it's a really interesting kind of twist on things.
It's suddenly become very human.
Yeah.
And very personal, actually. And I think that's you need to leverage it. Don't overplay it. But I think there's a job to do in terms of leveraging some of that. We're not seeing the chief executive first. We're seeing kind of Bob in his living room with his kids interrupting.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Yeah.
You've both talked a little bit about, connecting employees with the journey that a company's going on. But Jennifer, how do you think you can actually drive a connection and that sense of community again amongst employees so they feel more connected to one another at a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it builds on what Paul and Viva were just talking about. It's this relatable storytelling, I think, and I know storytelling is a bit of a buzzword in our field at the moment, but I think this has taught us how important storytelling is. And in this instance, storytelling isn't just about what happens when you go to work. Storytelling is suddenly becoming your whole lives. And I think that's quite special. And it needs care, and you need to take care with that information and that vulnerability that some people put themselves in order to share. But I think to keep people connected, and back to what we're all saying, we're all kind of all in it together. And actually, my struggle might be different to your struggle, but we're still struggling. And how can I help, more importantly? So it's not just we can't get by, but it's actually how can we move forward together? So I think from a communications perspective, when you're thinking about sharing, when you're thinking about storytelling, you can weave that into your updates. You can weave that into your directional strategy. Where are we going? I think that is quite a clever way to leverage the situation that we're in. So again, I agree, when we're in our CEO's living room or their personal home, actually, as an employee, maybe before, we see leadership as something, I guess leadership is something that we're not part of if you're not a leader. And actually, in this instance, you can use communication to break down, I think, some of that hierarchical boundaries. And then we just become people. We're all people, and we're all people trying to get from A to B during quite still a difficult time. So I think it's about, how do you bring some of that, some of those stories alive? And again, content channels, all of that will know, but actually it's the essence of that content, I think. And again, I think it's not just top down or bottom up. Actually, it should be a real mix. So how are teams communicating with each other? How are we storytelling and sharing, peer to peer? How are we doing that outside of our teams to other functions? What are we hearing from leadership? And again, not just hearing from leadership as in one-way communication, but actually, how can I share how I'm feeling or thinking, or what I think of some of the strategic things that we're doing? And how can comms really facilitate a conversation, not just passing of information?
One of the things you talked about just then was how you kind of galvanize people around a new strategy or new direction, and that's something that you did really successfully at Direct Line Group. What do you think, made that such a successful experience? What's the secret formula?
God, I wish there was a secret formula. So actually, if I'm honest, I'll tell you what the real challenge was. So just before Christmas, we launched a new purpose, a new vision, a new strategy, both externally to the market, but also to our people. And, we had this wonderful comms strategy that kind of went through various phases over various months to kind of get us to a lot of those outcomes we're all talking about, which is a connection and engaged workforce. Then we kind of get post-Christmas, and when we were supposed to be moving into sort of phase 2 of that, how do you bring it alive for our people, not just tell them what it is? Suddenly we're all at home. So again, a lot of our sort of traditional methods of doing that, we suddenly couldn't do. And for me, and I've mentioned this before, this actually provided an opportunity. And I guess day one, nobody saw it as an opportunity. Day one, it's just a big challenge. But you have an opportunity where we have just told our workforce what we stand for, what we're trying to achieve, and more importantly, how we think we're going to get there, and what behaviors we need you, our people, to display to help us achieve what we want to achieve as a business. We're now in a global crisis, and I go back to a lot of the decisions we were having to make, whether that's at a really high strategic level, all the way through to actually what do I do with my team as a leader, all of that was rooted in our values and our behaviors. And all of it was rooted to where we wanted to go strategically as a business. And as Victoria said, yeah, of course, we've had to adapt and change. But what was really important was for us to share that thinking with our people. And traditionally, we probably would have waited till that thinking was really polished and finite. But what was nice, and I think what people really appreciate when we go to openness, is that we're sharing as we go along, and accepting that it might not be a finished product, but we want to bring you into where we think we need to go as an organization, because the world outside our doors are changing. So for me, that is an opportunity. And I think the next challenge is when we're slightly out of crisis mode, which we are. We're now in kind of, how do we maintain this and how do we come out of it? How do you bring some of those new ways of communicating that became a real opportunity? And how do you ensure that that can be sustained through what's going to be quite a long period of time?
Thank you all. And we have one final question from our community, which we're now going to hijack and use at the end of every single one of these conversations. People would like to know what most excites you about the future, given that, the world of work has fundamentally changed. What is it that, is going to get you up in the morning and really excite you about the coming months and year?
Should I start?
Ivan.
I actually think just that, the fact that the world of work is changing, and we can be, if we choose to be, at the heart of defining what the new world looks like. I think we've got a pivotal role as communications and engagement experts in having a voice at the table and helping shape what that employee experience could and should look like, how we connect the employee experience to the customer experience, because the customer experience for some organisations will have also changed fundamentally. And I think there's a really, really, really strong opportunity to close the gap. And that's exciting, because I think in some respects, that's what we've been trying to do as communication and engagement experts for quite a long time. And now we've almost got a catalyst that's going to move that journey and move that story on, and that agenda on quite substantially. So I think it's exciting times for us, actually.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, that's really exciting as well, because I think coming out of pandemic, it's really demonstrated how communications and why communications should have a seat at the top table. You know, that it's not just a reactive discipline anymore, that it can be really, really strategic to, as you say, kind of connect your employees to your customers and your culture and what you're trying to achieve from your business objectives. And I think for me, there's something really exciting about how we tell that story, you know, how we blend the purpose with your culture, and how your culture is really changing, and how that serves your customers. It's a really, really, really powerful docking in point for everyone, but it's pivoting. And so for me, I'm really excited to kind of work out what that next chapter in the story is, and how we enable our employees to engage with that changing blended culture, whatever that looks like, because it will shift. And for me, it'd be really interesting to see what that looks like in terms of engagement and productivity, and even kind of customer interaction, because it will shift. But I think it's a really positive, and I wonder also whether from an employee perspective, you take away from that actually, yes, we've got a bit more of a blended approach, and does that give people a lot more freedom and ownership to work the way that works for them and their life and the other things that they're juggling? Will that make people even more productive and even more docked into the business? You know, if the business is really kind of, we talked about it earlier about your values kind of showing up in times of crisis. Well, also, does your culture and how you support your employees really show up, and will that kind of improve productivity, engagement, because we've kind of moved into this new blended way of working?
Yeah, and I completely agree with all of that, so I'm not going to repeat it. So I guess my addition to that, or a slightly different take, would be, I think as communication professionals, I go back to, it's an opportunity. Quite scary time still at the moment, still a lot of uncertainty, and again, everybody's going through their own version of their challenges. But I think as professionals in communication, we've got an opportunity to do something differently. So I guess my thing out there would be, I encourage you maybe to tear up the paper a bit and maybe start with a blank piece of paper and say, well, actually, if our organization was born today in this world, how would we communicate and operate? And you might find some very, very different answers. And I think people are more open to that than possibly we were pre-COVID. So I would just urge everyone to take that opportunity. Of course, you'll have to look at what's right for you culturally and operationally, but I can bet when we come out of this, and if we were to do another version of this panel, which is a bit of a case study of then and now, we will see some fundamentally really different and exciting things.
We'll take you up on that offer. We'll reconvene in a few years and see what's changed.
See what's happening.
Thank you all very much for sharing your experiences and your insights. I hope that all those watching found this conversation useful too. We would love to know what else you'd like to hear about in the coming months. So please do drop us a line at hello@unitedcultureco.com with any thoughts. In the meantime, stay tuned for the next webinar, which is with Scott Northcutt and Jennifer Mertz of Bacardi, who'll be talking about how they have leveraged their amazing culture to help spark growth in their business. Thank you again, Jennifer, Paul, Victoria, and we hope to see everyone in person very soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.